you write that litigation has the ability to push sexual violence discourse from the public sphere. Why do lawsuits or threats of lawsuits stifle this conversation? What is it when someone gets served?
So, really sound legal advice. Any good lawyer will tell you, stop talking about it. And what that does, and if you can look at my case, for example, 6 years goes by and you can't talk about it. There was somebody, for example, who in the book was sued by an organization for speaking about sexual violence. And although they withdrew the lawsuit the eve of going to trial, that was 5 years that she wasn't speaking about. It was a physician who was sexually assaulting patients. So it takes these discussions, really important discussions, out of media who might be maybe risk averse to publish these kinds of stories when you have a litigious person. But also I argue that even beyond the public sphere, there's lawsuits for people disclosing to family members and in these private settings. And what we know about sexual harm is it's really critical that you can have these open conversations about what happened to you. So I really do worry that if these lawsuits are to continue, especially in these private settings, especially when people are making formal reports, how can we continue to encourage people to take these steps with the possibility that they could be sued in defamation?
I want to pick up on the point you made about the media, because I want to know, what does fear of litigation do to people like us? And what I mean by that is people who are writing books, who are talking about current events in the media. Because as you mentioned in your book, pre-Me Too, there was the ability in media to offer some anonymity. And we see that post-Me Too, that in terms of media, that option isn't necessarily there as much. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, from my conversations with people who wanted to go to media in a post-Me Too context, there were, like you said, a lot fewer opportunities to do so anonymously. And it's really from this liability or concern about having anonymous accusers. For example, men initiating defamation actions to get the names, and it creates an additional challenge, I think, and especially within the climate of news media right now and being a bit more risk averse. And I write about freelance authors, for example, who maybe don't have the same access to in-house counsel or an insurance policy that will cover them if they get sued in defamation. So I did notice that there were a chilling effect on the types of stories that are being reported, and I even write about this in the book. As much as I critique media, I also did the same things. Right. I criticize in terms of not having the full details of what happened, or what some of the people would call watering down allegations, removal of names, and it becomes a lot more sanitized. But it was also of my own fear of being sued in defamation for this book. So it is a definite challenge, and I think that there is definite need to reevaluate defamation laws and who they are actually protecting in the Canadian context, and specifically in media, as well as those who make formal reports.
Well, let's talk about that one. I want to talk about more of the gender binary in that. Chapter 3 of your book is called The Gender of Reputation. You write that defamation law has different consequences for men and women in Canada, obviously looking at it from a historical stance as well. Why is that?
So I thought this was kind of the most, the most interesting part of the research process for me was seeing the kind of what I call the gender underpinnings of defamation law and why defamation law was even created. And it was created at a time when there was a desire to encourage civil society so men would rely less on bloody duels. Right. So if you put it in that context of why it was created, it was really to encourage public discourse instead of relying on violence. And so historically, men would typically sue for dishonor to their reputation that would result in damages to their ability to make money. Whereas when women sued historically, it was primarily in relation to their ability to marry and was often intertwined with commentary about their sexuality. Mm-hmm. So it was very much gendered historically and continues to be so in terms of how we value men's reputation versus women's reputation. And I thought that was a really critical piece in this book because so much focus was on the reputational damage experienced by the men who've been accused of sexual assault. And even myself, as I was doing this research, spent It took me a while to realize the reputational damage that is experienced by people who report or disclose sexual assault and then are sued. And there were really profound professional consequences for a lot of these people who either spoke up directly or were supporting somebody in reporting.
I do have to ask this question. What about when a man accused of sexual violence is innocent? Wouldn't a defamation suit be an important tool to restore that reputation?
I think that's such a critical question, and I think it's really important because what we're seeing is so much focus on the false accusations and that there's this societal problem of false reporting when the statistics really show us otherwise. False reporting is a very small percentage. What we know about gendered violence, however, it impacts a lot of people, and we have a systemic problem, declared epidemic levels of gendered violence. And so constantly worrying about the false accusations at the expense of encouraging reporting and disclosure, I think, is problematic at its core. But I do think there needs to be avenues when false reports are made, but false reporting is not happening at the frequency in which these defamation lawsuits are being initiated and actioned.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.